Hello, hi everyone. Welcome back, and thank you for joining on day 2 of our 5-day training program to introduce you to AWS Cloud and AI on the AWS platform. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us again today. I hope you're going to find this second day of and our second installment really useful and beneficial in understanding the AWS Cloud Platform. Before I go any further, I just want to confirm that you can see my screen and that I'm audible. If you could please put a thumbs up or something in the chat or in the reactions, that would be awesome. Thank you so much. So just confirm if I'm audible, then that would be great. Okay. Awesome. Thank you. Okay, so let's get started. So yesterday we did a quick introduction to the to cloud computing in general, what the concept behind cloud computing was, and I hope it was really beginner friendly to help everyone get to grips with what is, after all, this cloud computing and what makes cloud computing really possible. Today we're going to dive deep a little bit further and start looking at some of the services on AWS. That you're going to be in a position to use in order to build your application solution. So ultimately, the game plan here is that by Friday, you have an awareness and an understanding of various services that you can bring together to build an application. Now, because this is just a 10-hour course, obviously, we're not going to cover every single service that you're going to use on AWS, but we will use and look at some of the really core features and core services that are important in any application stack. If you remember from yesterday, if you joined us yesterday, you would know for a fact that now we've got 5 key pillars to build any application. That's compute, network, storage, and databases. And the 5th one being security. And I hope you all remember that from yesterday for those of you who attended. Security is going to be paramount importance regardless of whatever you do in the cloud. Okay, so we're just going to get started now then with today's session. Just give me a minute and just checking that we've got everything in place. And I also want to make sure that I'm able to also demonstrate the lab, which we'll do later on. Okay, all right, awesome. Okay, so yesterday we covered day 1. We also had a look at identity and access management, if you remember from yesterday's session. And identity and access management was focused on ensuring that you make sure who it is that can access your AWS account. Now, I hope you also did the homework and you were able to set up your AWS free plan account, or you already have an AWS account, because by Friday, once we've done the lab, it would be really awesome if you can carry out that same exercise in your AWS account, perhaps over the weekend or even just after we complete on Friday, because it will give you good hands-on experience, which is really what hiring managers, employers, and recruiters are looking for. So the session today is going to look at Amazon S3, which is a cloud storage service, more precisely an object storage platform, and Amazon CloudFront. Now, if you remember from yesterday, we took a look at edge locations. Edge locations is part of the AWS global infrastructure that allows you to distribute your content across the globe using cache capability, so that if a user is accessing your content, maybe videos, images, documents, whatever it might be, from the other side of the planet, the latency, the amount of time it takes to actually retrieve that data, is drastically reduced because of edge locations. So CloudFront is an AWS service that allows you to achieve that, to distribute your content globally across these edge locations. So we'll be taking a look at Amazon S3 and CloudFront today. And so yesterday's agenda, we've completed yesterday. There's a tick box there, and I really hope you enjoyed it. Today is an introduction to Amazon S3 and content delivery with Amazon CloudFront, with AWS CloudFront. Okay, now before we go any further, you will remember yesterday we also spoke about Lovable, right? Lovable.dev, which is this amazing AI web application that you can use in order to build and vibe code a website, a web application of your choice. It could be a simple landing page, or it could be a really complex end-to-end application. And I mentioned yesterday, and I showcased an example, a live demonstration about how we can use Lovable to build our resume website. Because instead of sending out documents like your PDF or a Word document to a recruiter, you can just point them to your website, which is your resume website that will look naturally awesome in all of the HTML and CSS styling. And then that will be really presentable as well, easy navigation, etc., for the recruiter to go through. And if we just go back to Lovable again, so let me just quickly bring that up. Just 1 second. Okay, so if you remember from yesterday's session, okay, and let me just reshare the screen very quickly. Okay. Actually, let's just reshare the screen. Bear with me 1 second. Just reshare the screen so you can see this all clearly. Okay, so you should be able to see my screen now. And so basically, when you take a look at the Lovable website, all I did was, so if I go down to projects, and we'll take a look at the projects that we ran through, you will see that I created this website for a person called Jason Coffey. Okay, and all I did was I provided a prompt. Can you create a resume website using my uploaded CV, which is in PDF format? Literally, that was the prompt. And obviously, I provided the PDF document, which contains Jason Coffey's resume. And we can even take a look at that, actually. So just give me a second. We'll quickly take a look at that as well. See what that actually looks like. Okay, so I captured some of Jason Coffey's resume in a PDF document, and that document was then uploaded to Lovable website. And then I just provided this prompt that says, can you create a resume website using my uploaded CV, which is in PDF format? And it took about less than 5 minutes, and it came out with this wonderful web page, okay, that we can publish. So it's got the name, it's got a title, a quick synopsis of what he can do, a LinkedIn button, key achievement, which again, it's pulled out from that PDF document, experiences, okay, over his work experience, skill sets, education, and so on and so forth, right? Fairly simple, fairly easy. Now, what I would like you to understand here is that when we uploaded this resume PDF document, obviously Lovable had to capture the data that's in it. But before doing so, Lovable had to store that particular PDF document somewhere so that it can work with the document. Okay. So Lovable is using some sort of storage service, right? And one of the most popular storage services that you can use for this type of application is Amazon S3. And that is why we're looking at Amazon S3 today. So Amazon S3 is an object storage solution that allows you to store documents, images, videos, binary files, code, whatever it is, whatever you like, as objects. And that's what we're going to take a look at today. So when building the Lovable application, when you decide to, for instance, build your own web application that can generate resume websites, for example, you need somewhere to store your users' data. Okay, you need some sort of storage platform. And that's where something like Amazon S3 can be highly beneficial. So hopefully that kind of gives you a use case as to where a site like Lovable or any of the other hundreds and thousands of AI websites out there that are potentially using cloud providers like Amazon S3 or Azure Blob or Google Cloud's version of that same storage service to store the data for you. So this is really important. The storage platform that you use in order to manage your users' data is going to be critically important in how you architect and build your solution. The other reason for showcasing Lovable, as with any other, AI creating websites that generate for you based on vibe coding, based on prompting, etc. We spoke briefly yesterday that the design pattern is going to be probabilistic. Okay, so if I go back to my dashboard, let's go back to the dashboard, and I go to all projects. I mentioned yesterday that I had done the same request with the same prompt 3 times a few days ago, and then yesterday live we did another one. For some weird and wonderful reason, it's decided to come up with, a white background instead of the old black background that it was creating before. In other words, AI applications, when you're prompting them to do something, because they are what we call probabilistic, they are not, deterministic. And as a result of that, exactly how the output is manufactured and provided and presented to you can change from time to time. And I'm sure you're aware, and if you can give me a thumbs up in the chat on the reactions, every time you ask AI like ChatGPT or Claude or whatever it might be, the same question, you might get a slightly varying different answer, right? The context might still be the same, but the answers might vary slightly. The responses might vary slightly. And this is where you need to understand that when you're building AI applications, for a lot of use cases, this is perfect, okay? We can further go through the prompt and be more explicit in the way how we describe how we want the website to look, perhaps the type of colors, we can provide the RGB codes, etc. And then hopefully the AI application will build our solution for us in more or less the same way that we want it. But if you want exactly specific requirements, time and time again, in a repeatable fashion, you need to have some level of deterministic element to it so that you can define exactly how the output is going to be. Okay, and this is particularly useful in certain industries like banking, like insurance, like healthcare, where if you're using AI to actually create solutions and output and create content of any kind, you need to make sure that you have consistency in place in the way how that output might be presented to you. So this is really important. And that doesn't mean that you cannot use AI. In fact, you can use AI, but the way how you use AI tools and large language models and all of those wonderful things needs to be slightly different in the way how you build your application stack. So this is what I really wanted to highlight over here. And as we progress through this week, you're going to end up on Friday, hopefully building a portion of an application where you can have AI help you manage content more efficiently and create content in a way that's consumable, but have code that can define the deterministic element to it so that the output is exactly as you want it. Okay, so that's what we're trying to achieve this week. Okay, give me a second. I'm going to reshare the slide deck. Okay, so we'll just go ahead and reshare the slide deck next. Okay, and if you can let me know whether you are able to see my screen, that will be absolutely wonderful. Okay, awesome. Thank you so much. Okay, so as I was saying, Lovable is a great application. There are thousands of different ones out there that can do the same thing for you. Ultimately, you want to be in a position to build applications that can do exactly the same thing, but perhaps depending on the use case and depending on the industry you're working in, you might need a more deterministic solution at the end of the day. And we can use AI and other toolkits and services on the AWS platform to try and achieve that. So let's move on with today's session finally. Let's talk about Amazon S3, which, as I mentioned, is something that lots of organizations, lots of companies would use to store customer data. In the case of, Lovable or any other AI application, when you're uploading files and any kind of objects to that platform, there's a good chance that they're probably using Amazon S3 in the back end, okay, to actually store the data. So Amazon S3 is a storage solution. And before we actually jump into Amazon S3 and its core features and intricate details, it's important for those of you who are beginners out there to understand that there are actually different types of storage services available to us. And in fact, there are 3 ways to store data in the cloud. And it's important to understand this as a foundational element when you're moving into cloud or any kind of IT related role. So the first one, probably not probably not the earliest one, but the first one is what we're going to relate to and talk about today, which is object storage. So object storage, you can think of it as a big, massive warehouse. Okay, you put parcels in and you retrieve them by an address. Okay, so your parcels are your objects, videos, images, any kind of data, right? And they have an address or an ID of some kind. That ID allows you to retrieve them. There's no folders, there's no hierarchy, just a flat warehouse where every item has a unique label that can be accessed via a URL or some form of key that allows you to identify them. So you can store any file and you can retrieve it usually over HTTP, so usually over the internet. It scales infinitely and there's no extensive management needed. And Amazon S3 is an object storage platform that is available to you on AWS. You've got block storage. Now, block storage is your raw hard drive. So if you're using a laptop to connect to this session today, there's a hard drive in your laptop. It might be a brand new laptop, so you might have one of those fancy NVMe's, solid state drives and what have you. But at the end of the day, block storage is what is directly connected to your laptop or to your server or to your computer. The operating system uses what's known as a storage subsystem to format the hard drive in a way so that it can consume it. And block storage works by allowing your data to be broken up into chunks and stored in those chunks as blocks on the actual drive. And then it does the same thing. When you try and retrieve your data, it'll actually reassemble the individual chunks to create your file for you and present it for you. Block storage gives you very low latency disk attached to your computer. So it's really fast when you compare it to other storage services like file systems that are on the network or something like Amazon storage service, Amazon S3. So block storage is what is the actual hard drive that you might be using. And on AWS, we use Amazon EBS, Elastic Block Store for that. When you create a web server, when you launch a server with Linux or Windows, you'll be using EBS in order to host the operating system. Okay, and block storage allows you to do things like install applications, format them, define partitions, etc. So what this actually means is if you need to install an application on some storage service, you need to use block storage. You can't use object storage. So they have different use cases, and that's important to distinguish when you're designing your application stack. We've got file storage, which is a shared file system. So you can think of it as a shared filing room. The filing room has multiple people that can go in and out simultaneously. Everyone sees the same folders and files, and it's a familiar hierarchy. So if you think of a filing cabinet, right? A filing cabinet which has got various drawers, and then you can open them up and then access your files by identifying which folder you need and perhaps any subfolders as well. Okay, so these file storage services on AWS, one of the most common file storage service is known as Amazon EFS or Elastic File System. It allows you to mount the file system on your operating system, on your computer, so that you can connect to it over the network. So the key difference between Elastic Block Storage and Elastic File System is that Elastic Block Storage is attached, although over the network it's attached and presented to your computer or your server directly, so your computer can install applications, format it, and do whatever it needs to do with it. EFS is a file system that's on the network and that allows you to share files with other computers and other servers in the network. Okay, so it presents you with a filing system, and depending on the type of operating system you're using, there are different file systems, but you can think of it as a filing cabinet that everyone or all of your servers or computers can share files between them. And then we have, obviously, just going back, just to recap, object storage, that's completely different. That's like this big, massive warehouse where you can store all of your data as objects individually and in its entirety, and they're all referenceable by some sort of unique ID or over the internet using a URL. So when it comes to making a decision whether you should use object storage or block storage or file storage, another thing that you need to be aware of is the access method and the ability to interact with that service. So like Amazon S3, you would access it using a URL or an HTTP. It gives you the ability to have shared access to it. You can attach, so you can use your EC2 instance that's running your application to connect to S3 and download and upload files. Okay, but it's not in the same fashion as a hard drive being directly attached to your computer. And up until recently, you also couldn't mount a S3 bucket onto your operating system. So you couldn't see it as a local drive, for instance. Now that's recently changed. In fact, Amazon has taken many, many years to come out with this new capability, which I'll talk about in a second. It's best so it gives you've got almost unlimited amount of storage that you can have on the platform. It's best for files and media, so videos, images, that kind of thing. And the service that you would use is Amazon S3. EBS is your hard drive directly attached to your computer, gives you low latency access. One EBS volume for one server, okay? Kind of like, you're putting your hard drive in your laptop. I'm not going to be able to access it unless I take it out and put it in my laptop, that kind of thing. That's what EBS is. It can go in terms of size, you can get up to 64 terabytes in size. It's best for managing your service and for giving storage to your service to host the operating system and any local databases. And on the AWS platform, we use Amazon AWS for it. EFS, like I said, is a network file system. So the idea with EFS is that it's a file system that you can share between servers. So if you need to share files between your servers, whether they're running Linux or Windows, then you can use a file system. If you're using Linux-based systems, you would use EFS. If you're using Windows-based system, there is another product called Amazon FSx for Windows File Server. Again, it's the same concept. The idea is that there is a central file system that all of your servers can connect to and share files between them. Okay, so that is a quick overview of the different types of storage services and where you would use them, what use case you would have for them. Okay. So let's move on and actually take a look at Amazon S3, because Amazon S3 is probably one of the most highly and widely used service across there. So when you think about Amazon S3, like I said earlier, you need to think about your files as objects, okay? And each object has a unique ID and has the ability to store lots of metadata around it so that it's easily identifiable and categorizable, okay? And so ultimately, if you take a look at Amazon S3, what you do with Amazon S3 is you create something called a bucket. And in that bucket, you can put objects in. And your objects are your files, Excel, Word, PDFs, images, videos, Python files, whatever it is you like. Okay, but each and every file is an object in its entirety. Just so you're aware, at the very low level, we're still using block storage devices because these storage services need to be connected to some sort of compute service. Okay, so at a very low level, we're still using block storage devices. What Amazon S3 is actually doing, it's abstracting away that layer from you so that you're able to interact with the service as an object storage platform. So if you've used Google Drive, okay, it's fairly similar to Google Drive. So with Google Drive, you've got a drive and basically you can, upload files and download files in the entirety with Google Drive as well. So some of the key features and concepts related to Amazon S3 is that firstly, it's a global object storage solution. You can access the data on any S3 bucket from anywhere on the planet. So it's available on the internet if you wish to make it publicly accessible. But the data and the actual bucket is hosted in a specific region. So this is an important thing to understand. When you're working with any organizations, one of the biggest challenges that they have is they want to make sure that their data is in a specific location for data sovereignty, data residency requirements, right? So your data physically sits in one specific region. We spoke about regions, availability zones yesterday. You might choose to locate all of your data, say, for instance, in the London region or in the North Virginia region or in the Hyderabad region or in the Sydney region. Once you create a bucket, you choose the region you want to put it in, so then you can fulfill those compliance and legal requirements. But if you like, at the same time, you can still allow users across the globe to be able to access the data over the internet to your specific region where you've stored it. Okay, so that is something to be aware of. Data is stored as objects with metadata and a global unique identifier. Okay, so you can actually identify the data very quickly. And It allows you to make the actual bucket publicly available so that you can distribute content to your end users freely. Okay, and there's multiple ways to actually connect to the actual bucket as well. So for instance, if you are another Netflix, okay, maybe you would store all of your videos in these buckets, and then at the end of the day, be able to stream them across to your users. So the use cases are things like you can, create data lakes, websites, mobile applications. Most companies and a lot of companies will use S3 for backups. Okay, they have lots of archival data, lots of data that they need to store. Many companies have to fulfill legal requirements for storing data for 7 years or 10 years, and those archives can be stored in S3 buckets because A, you get virtually unlimited amount of storage, and B, Amazon S3 is the cheapest storage solution when compared to other storage services on the AWS platform. So the per gigabit rate is drastically less when compared to other storage services. It's designed for 11 nines of durability. Okay, so 99.99911 times in total of durability. And what that means is that if you store 1 billion files, about one file can potentially get lost in every 10 years. So it's highly, highly durable. Okay, and that's one of the reasons why a lot of companies use a product like Amazon S3. Now, there's a reason for why you have such good durability. One of the reasons is quite simply is that the data is actually replicated across multiple devices, across multiple availability zones in that region. Now, yesterday we spoke about, the fact that you've got AWS, which have got multiple regions. Within each region, we've got a minimum of 3 availability zones, which are separate data centers across all of them. So we are able to be in a position where, you have the ability to distribute content across all of these devices, across all of these different locations within the same region, plus the fact that that replication is consistent and AWS takes care of it. And so AWS is able to give you that level of durability and not have you losing your data. Okay. So whether it's a single CSV file or high resolution video, you can store absolutely any amount of data, almost unlimited amount of data on the S3 platform. Okay, let's move on then. Now, when you create a bucket, there's a couple of things to be aware of. Like with anything on AWS, like with anything in the cloud, security is going to be of paramount importance. When you create a bucket, by default, AWS does a couple of things. A, it's private. Okay, so it's not accessible on the internet unless you make changes to the bucket and you attach what are called bucket policies to it. So bucket policies are basically a set of permissions that is usually written in JSON that define exactly who or what can access the data in your bucket and whether they can access any of the buckets at all that you create. So these policies define exactly who can access the data. Now, there are two types of policies you can create. One is IAM policies. Yesterday, we spoke about creating IAM users, and hopefully you've created your IAM user and attached the administrator access permission policy to it. So that gives your user the ability to access anything on the AWS platform. Okay, these IAM permissions can be defined more granularly. So you define exactly what buckets or what resources they can access. So you can create an IAM policy, attach it to a user, and then define what it is that user can do with any of those buckets. Or you can create a bucket policy, attach it directly to the bucket, and define who or what can access that bucket. So there's two ways of accessing or defining policies for your bucket. The key difference between the two is that with bucket policies, you can allow anonymous access. Okay, now this is important. If you want to be the next Netflix, then obviously what you want to do, or if you want to distribute, say, some videos or some images or some documents on any kind of social media platform, okay, you might choose to, for instance, first host your data in an S3 bucket. Okay, and then make it publicly accessible. Or maybe you're distributing some free content for everyone across the planet to access. Then you need to allow anonymous access. And so if you want to grant anonymous access, you would use something called bucket policies to define that. Okay. And when it comes to accessing your buckets and the data within them, well, there are multiple ways of doing it. So you can use the console, like we used the console yesterday to create a user, an IAM user. We'll be going into the console later in this session to actually create a bucket. I'll show you how to do that. You can use the command line interface. You can make API calls using a programming language of your choice, okay, like Python, Java, whatever you like, and you can access it over the internet as well. Okay, so it's got a URL address if you make it accessible that way as well. So there are multiple ways to access the data in your bucket. Now, one of the things with Amazon S3 is that previously, when you created a bucket, okay, they needed to have a name that was globally unique. And that's still the case, but recently they've made a change to it. So what that means is prior to March 2026, we had a situation where if you create what's known as a general purpose bucket, you need to give that bucket a name. The name needs to be unique. So for instance, you couldn't use a name like marketing or finance. And that's because someone many, many years ago has already taken that name. Okay, because these names are addressable over the internet, you cannot use those common names. So a lot of companies, they would just attach their company name with the bucket. They'll say my company hyphen marketing or my company hyphen finance, whatever it might be, and then maybe add some unique numbers or sequences. They would have a naming convention at the end of the day that they would choose in order to make their buckets unique so that the buckets can be created. Now, as of March 2026, Amazon S3 introduced regional namespaces. Okay, so this allows buckets to be globally unique within an account and a region rather than globally. So what this means is the naming style has changed, and it actually includes the account ID as well, which kind of makes it really easy to get the kind of names that you want for your buckets. Okay, so there are different ways of handling the situation. Previously, what we had to do was we had to make sure that if I'm creating a bucket called resume, right, I have to have something that's a bit more unique than that. So maybe resume hyphen 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That's probably taken as well. So resume hyphen mycompany.com or whatever it is, you have to come up with a more unique name. Now it's a lot more easier. Let's talk a little bit more about buckets and objects and how they relate to each other and some key features and concepts that you need to be aware of when you're working with S3. So when it comes to Amazon S3, as I mentioned to you earlier, you can host your buckets in any region that you like. So here we've got a bucket that's hosted in US East 1, which is the North Virginia region. Here's another bucket hosted in London, which is EU West 2. So making a decision where you place your bucket is really critically important. Firstly, as I mentioned earlier, it's probably going to be based on the data residency and sovereignty laws that your company might be obliged to. Okay, so maybe you do have to store all of your data in the US or in India or in the UK or in some part of Europe, right? The other reason that you would make a decision on where you create your buckets is also in closer proximity to your end users. Okay, so if you've got a lot of users that are going to be accessing the bucket in Australia and you're, and you don't have any of those legal requirements to host it just in the US, then you might choose to create the bucket in Australia because it makes more sense. You get low latency access to your data. Also, when it comes to the name of the bucket, that's usually 3 to 63 characters in length. The naming convention is really important. As I mentioned earlier, they need to be unique if you're having a globally named bucket, or you could have regional named buckets, but they need to be lowercase letters, numbers. You can use dots, you can use hyphens. They cannot start with an IP address. And there's usually 100 soft limits, so 100 buckets that you can create in your AWS account. You can increase this to 1,000 buckets per account if you need to. Okay, so that's the hard limit there. So there's a soft limit of 100 and there's a hard limit of 1,000. To get to the hard limit, you would need to raise a support request with AWS, but that's something that's fairly easy to do. When you're choosing to create your bucket in a specific region, I mentioned earlier that AWS offers you 11 nines of durability and the fact that they replicate your data between different devices, between different availability zones in a region. What they will never do is replicate your data across region because they need to ensure that you are fulfilling any compliance or legal requirements that you might have as an organization. So of their own accord, AWS will never replicate your data to other regions, but you can choose to do so if that's a requirement for your organization. You can choose to replicate your data from one bucket in the US to another bucket in the UK, if you so wish, if you're not having those restrictions depending on the industry that you are in. Okay, so what happens there is if you are able to replicate your data across multiple regions, okay, you increase obviously the durability. The durability still is 11 nines, but you increase the availability, because if an entire region goes down, there's a huge outage, a natural disaster, whatever, your data is safe in a different region altogether. Okay, and it might even be a compliance requirement to move and copy your data from one region to another. Perhaps that is actually the compliance requirement that you have to make sure that a backup of your data is on the other side of the planet in case a natural disaster were to strike. You've got, as an end user, okay, as a customer, therefore, like I said, you've got the option of replicating data from one bucket to another across region or within the same region. But this allows you to ensure that you're able to have disaster recovery, business continuity, and the ability to store backups in other locations. Now, you may replicate your data between regions, not for those purposes, but instead because you want your data to be accessible to your various branch offices that you have in those countries. So you may be a multinational organization. You've got, different branch offices everywhere, and you want the data closer to your end users across the company. Okay. So I want to now move on and take a look at how objects are managed and, stored in an S3 bucket. So here we have just a quick demonstration. We've got some users or an application uploading data to a particular bucket. Now, the actual object, there's a few key features and concepts and caveats to be aware of. The size of the object can range from 0 to a maximum of 50 terabytes. So every object, the maximum size of it can be 50 terabytes. The object is defined as a key value pair. So the key is the name of the object. Okay, so in this case, it's a JPEG object, so it's obviously an image. And then the value is basically the binary of the actual the binary data that is the value of the data. Okay, so that is how AWS looks at your objects. There's a key, the name, and then the associated value, which is the binary data that it is that represents whatever that object is, a file, an image, a video, whatever it might be. Object storage, especially with Amazon S3, is a flat file structure. There's no filing system hierarchy like you might be used to, when you're managing all of your files and folders and your operating system in your file explorer or your Finder. Doesn't work like that. With object storage, everything is flat file because all objects are referenceable using a GUID, a unique identifier, and obviously this also allows the object to be stored in its entirety. And furthermore, the object is also accessible as a complete object in itself. But rather than having a folder structure and a file system, it doesn't do any of that. It just stores it as a flat file structure. That said, AWS gives you the opportunity with these general purpose buckets to use what are called prefixes and delimiters. So every object that is stored, so here we've got blueberry muffin, chocolate muffin doc. So there are three Word documents, and then we've got some additional data, but we're making use of the slash and prefix, okay? And what these slashes and prefixes do is they allow you to categorize your data, or the slash is a delimiter, and the prefix is just another word of categorizing your actual data. So what you could do is you could collect all the data that are part of the archive prefix, and here all of the data that are part of the latest prefix. And so this allows you to basically create categories of your data that you can then manage as a whole. The one thing to be aware of is that the key now becomes the entire string. Okay, so we've got a delimiter, the archive, a delimiter, and the actual name of the file. That entire string is now the key of the file. So you could have archive walnut cake, archive raspberry cake, archive chocolate cake, and so they all become part of that same category. This has look and feel effect of a folder structure. So it looks and feels like a folder structure, but it isn't. It's still flat file. Now, recently, AWS has come up with what's known as a directory service where you can have an S3 bucket that actually has a directory structure built in it to give you a full file folder structure system. But that's a topic for another day. The general purpose buckets are all flat file in nature. One of the other reasons that you might want to create these delimiters and prefixes is because they actually improve the performance when you're accessing your data. If you imagine you have millions of objects in a given bucket or across multiple buckets, if you have them all across a flat file structure, when you're querying and trying to retrieve those objects, there's a performance hit that might be experienced. Categorizing them using prefixes and delimiters improves the performance. And this is something I talk a lot about in my training program as well. So the prefix and delimiters can be used to limit the results of any list operation. So if you want to list all of the objects, you can use these prefixes to kind of narrow down the results of your queries of the files that you are trying to go through, and it just improves the performance drastically. Okay. Now, as I said, AWS has this wonderful ability of consistently evolving. If you look at AWS today and you go back a year, the UI has changed, lots of different new services has come out. A very recent service or feature of Amazon S3 is the S3 file service. I've got an entire tutorial of how this works. Basically, it allows you to mount your S3 bucket onto your operating system, onto your actual server, so that you can access the S3 bucket almost as though it's a local disk over a network, which is really brilliant because it solves a lot of problems that developers used to have when they were interacting with S3. With S3, traditionally, what you had to do was you had to download the file, do whatever you wanted on it, and then upload it. And you couldn't make individual edits within the file itself very easily. And as a result of that, there were various interim temporary solutions that were available. There were some open source solutions as well. But this year, Amazon has come out with Amazon S3 files that allows you to mount buckets like it's a proper file system on your operating system, almost like another disk that you have on your actual computer. Okay, so it's really, really brilliant that way. If you're interested, take a look at that video. It's a full tutorial on how to set it up, and hopefully you'll find it useful. Okay, so what we'll do next is I'll go ahead and create a bucket. And I want to sort of tell you that this bucket that I'm creating today is one that I'm actually going to be using on Friday. So if you get an opportunity this evening, then please follow along with this video. Again, it's being live streamed on YouTube, so all of the step-by-step instructions is available in the video. Just follow along and go ahead and create this bucket as well that I'm just about to create, and it will be used on Friday. So let me just stop sharing, and what I'll do is I'll bring up my AWS Management Console. Okay, just give me a second. Okay, I'm just going to share the screen again. And what I want to do is I want to walk you through creating an S3 bucket next. Okay, so here we are on my AWS Management Console. Hopefully you've set yours up from yesterday's homework, and you've got a free plan AWS account, or you've got an existing AWS account. So we're going to go ahead and quickly do a search for S3. You just need to search for it there. And that will take me to the S3 console. Now, one of the things that you need to be aware of, as I mentioned right earlier, is that you need to make a decision as to where your S3 bucket is going to reside in terms of the actual region. So I've got by default, it's going to North Virginia in the United States. I'm going to leave it there. That's where I want my bucket to be created. So on the left-hand side, you've got general purpose directory buckets. I mentioned that a little bit earlier today, that allows you to create a directory hierarchy. Again, we'll not go into that today because that's a completely different topic altogether. You've got table buckets, and you've got now vector buckets. Just before we go ahead and create that bucket, I want to quickly say a word or two about vector buckets. If you're interested in building AI solutions, then one of the things that you're going to be doing, and you probably have heard of, is building retrieval augmented generation RAG solutions. What that is the ability to use your own corporate data and to query and analyze and access that data and have a conversation with it using AI tools and large language models. Vector buckets allow you to store that type of data. And again, on Friday, we'll revisit AI, not on Friday, on Thursday, we'll revisit, obviously, we'll talk about some AI tools and services, and I'll revisit that. But this is an absolute game changer because it's a lot cheaper than some of the other services that allows you to store all of your AI-related data. And we'll talk more about that on Thursday. Okay, so back to general purpose buckets. Okay, all you need to do is we basically will create a bucket. So I'm going to create a bucket under my name. And as I said, you've got the ability to use a global namespace or a regional namespace. I'm going to leave this as global namespace at the moment, and it's a general purpose bucket that I'm creating in the North Virginia region in US East 1. Okay, if you're choosing a different region, then you need to first make sure that you change the region you're in. For the purposes of this week, I suggest we all work in North Virginia, so everyone is on the same page. So if there's any issues, then I can obviously try and help you out much quicker. Okay, so the general purpose bucket is what we're creating, and we're going to use a global namespace, and I'm going to call this one, I'm just going to put my name, Rajesh Resume, something like Resume, yeah, Rajesh Resume website or something like that. Okay, so that's the name of my bucket. Hopefully I'll get that name. And there are different properties of your bucket. So one of the properties that you'll see is this block public access. You'll see that it's ticked by default, which means that every bucket that AWS creates is private by default. So we're going to leave this as it is. We want to keep it private for now. Obviously, this bucket is going to be used on Friday to host our resume website, the same resume website that I've been sort of encouraging you to build. That website is going to be publicly available, but for now, we're just going to block public access. And I'll explain about this a little bit later. Okay. Bucket versioning, I'll come on to that very shortly in this slide. One thing to be aware of, AWS also wants to ensure that your security posture is, top notch. So by default, they encrypt all of the data that's held in the bucket. Okay, so by default, all of the data that you store in an S3 bucket is encrypted using something called the Amazon S3 managed keys, server-side encryption. And when you're building solutions for your client, as I said earlier, you want to think about security, whether it's authentication and authorization, whether it's network security, whether it's data security, application security, encryption, all of that stuff right from the very start. So it used to be the case that this was optional many years ago, not anymore. AWS enforces the fact that the data is encrypted when it's stored in the S3 bucket. Okay, I'll go ahead and click Create Bucket. So again, this is fully recorded. This is getting recorded, so you can go through the video later on and create your bucket as well. Okay, so that's my bucket created. And inside of this bucket, I'm actually going to create a folder. Now, I just now said a few moments ago that there's no folder file structure hierarchy. There isn't. This is just a way of representing the data using those prefixes and delimiters I spoke about. But the UI makes it feel like it's a folder structure. So it makes us humans more comfortable. Okay, so I'll create a folder, and the folder that I'm going to create is just going to be website. Okay, so my resume is going to be in the website folder. Okay, and I'll go ahead and I'll click Create Folder. Okay. Okay, so that is my S3 bucket created. Now, just a couple of things before we go back to the slides. So if I go to properties, okay, so we can see that the bucket is in US East 1, and this was the creation date of the bucket. One of the things that you're going to be working with, if you get and start really working with AWS services, is using ARNs. Excuse me. So ARNs stands for Amazon Resource Name, and they basically uniquely identify every single resource you create. If you created a user yesterday in identity and access management, that user has got an ARN. If you create a server, the server has an ARN. If you create an IP address for your server, the IP address has an ARN. Every single resource that you create on AWS has an ARN, an Amazon Resource Name that uniquely allows you to identify that resource. That's kind of like how all of the API calls that you're making, which we spoke about yesterday, actually functions and actually is able to work because of this ability to uniquely identify every single object, every single resource you create. So my bucket has an ARN, an Amazon resource name. It's unique. There isn't another name like it across the planet. And so this allows me to uniquely identify it. Okay. I'll talk more about some of these other features like versioning and stuff in an upcoming slide. So for now, I just wanted to quickly show you that. And obviously we've got permissions as I've already mentioned. Block all public access is enabled by default, protecting your bucket from any accidental access or malicious access by anyone across on the internet. Okay, so let's move on. So that's our bucket created for now. And if I go back to objects, you will see that there are no objects. I've not uploaded anything. I've just created a folder called website. And this is what you will need to do as well as part of your homework for today. Okay, let me bring up the slide deck again. Just give me 1 second. And I'm just going to also answer a quick question. So is there any way to ensure any lost file information can be retrieved, and also how to overcome the limitation while being in S3? So this is a question from Vinayak. Vinayak, thank you for your question. So basically, we spoke yesterday about the shared responsibility model. Any data that you're putting in the cloud, you're responsible for how that data is stored. So using S3, there are various techniques to try and ensure that your data is safe. So I spoke very briefly earlier about the ability to replicate data from one region to another. That's something that you might consider. I'm going to talk about another service called versioning in a minute. It's a feature that allows you to store multiple versions of your documents so you avoid accidental deletions. And in terms of how you detect if any files are missing, this is going to be through some audit mechanism. And you can also use what is called event notifications to identify any objects, because remember, all of these files are considered objects if there is any objects that has been deleted. So event notification is a service that allows you to monitor all of the data in your S3 bucket. And if any file or object gets deleted, you can send an alert to yourself. So this is one way that perhaps you can detect if a file got deleted or is missing as well. But there are other techniques as well, and I can obviously take this offline and discuss it a bit further later on. Okay, let me just bring up the slide deck again. So we've created our S3 bucket, and I would highly recommend that you create yours this evening as well as part of the homework. So now that we've created a bucket, one thing to be aware of is that any data that you're storing in S3 has different use cases and different lifecycle requirements. You might store some data that you're accessing every day. You might store some data that you only need to access once in a way. You might store some data to fulfill compliance requirements for 10 years, and you never touch it unless the auditors come and visit you and they say they want to see that profit and loss account from 5 years ago. Okay, so unless that's the case, there's lots of data that you need to store, but there are different categories of data. Data that you're frequently accessing day in and day out, and you need instant access to it. Data that you never touch unless there's a real need to access. And for that reason, we've got something called the S3 storage classes. This is where you can choose the class that you're going to store it in, a storage class that defines exactly the use case for that data based on its usage, based on its accessibility, based on what the purpose of that data is, as to when you want to access it, how quickly you want to access it. And one of the benefits of using different storage classes is that depending on your level of access and what that use case is, the cost differs. So if you're accessing data every day, you need instant access to it. AWS, in their right, will charge you more for that service. If you're going to let your data sit in S3 and access it once a year, or perhaps once in a blue moon when the auditors need to see a document from 7 years ago, then they will charge you less for it because you're using and you are accessing the data less frequently. So the cost savings can be derived by following this process, by having a plan in place as to which storage class you store your data in. And so we've got different types of storage classes. We've got standard storage class, which is the default storage class. So for instance, when I just now created that bucket and I created a folder called website, if I start uploading data to it, any kind of objects to it, by default, it will sit in the standard storage class. This is the most frequently accessed instant access available class, and by far the most expensive as well. Okay, AWS will charge you not just for the storage. Okay, so on a per gigabit rate, so that it might be a few cents per gigabit. That rate changes depending on the class that you're storing your data in, but also they'll charge you on retrieval cost, how much data you are requesting from the region. Okay, so there's the transfer out fee as well, amongst a few other things like the number of requests that you make. So based on that, AWS will charge you for that service. So the standard storage class is the default class. It's by far the highest costing class. And when I say high, it's still relatively cheap when you compare it to EBS and EFS, but it's designed for active apps, websites with frequent access. So if you're going to create your any kind of website that needs instant access, then obviously this is the class to store your data in. Standard IA storage class is the next one. This is called, IA stands for infrequent access. So if you need instant access to your data, but you're not going to access it regularly, perhaps once a year or once every few months, or maybe you want to store a backup in case the primary standard, in case the primary data is corrupted or whatever, then you can use the standard IA storage class. The cost is lower, but there is a retrieval fee for it. And there's a minimum requirement to store the data for at least 30 days. Then there is intelligent tier. Now, sometimes we are storing data in the cloud, but we don't actually know how frequently we're going to access it. Sometimes we're accessing it every day. Suddenly for a week, we don't access it at all, and so on. With the standard and IA storage class, before you put your data in those classes, you need to know what the access pattern is going to look like. Okay, but with intelligent tier, AWS uses machine learning and artificial intelligence to determine how frequently you are accessing a piece of data, an object. If you're not accessing the data for more than 30 days, AWS automatically transitions it to an infrequent access class and gives you a cheaper rate. The minute you start accessing that particular object, it will shift it back into the standard class, and obviously the rate of access or the cost that is incurred will increase to the standard rate. So there is this feature for those use cases where the access pattern is not known. And as a result of that, AWS gives you this ability, this flexibility to use the intelligent tiering storage class. Okay, sorry, give me 1 second. Just lost the screen share. So just get the screen share working again. Okay, can I just get a confirmation you can still see my screen? Okay, awesome. Yeah. Apologies for that. Okay, so as I was mentioning, you've got different storage classes. So you've got the standard storage class, standard IA, infrequent access is another storage class. And so as a result of that, you get to make a decision. So the standard storage class is where you have the highest cost, but it's one that you're going to use if you're going to frequently and instantly need access to your data. Standard IA, you need access to your data instantly, but not so frequently. And so you can benefit from a lower cost. Intelligent tiering is where you don't know what the access pattern is going to be like. Okay, so that is the other option. The next storage class is one zone IA. Now, customers obviously want to reduce their overall storage cost. And so one of the options that you have is to store your data in a specific, in one availability zone in a given region. Now, as I mentioned earlier, in order to ensure high levels of availability and durability, AWS will replicate your data across multiple devices, across multiple availability zones in that given region, right? That's how they give you the 11 nines of durability. There's difference in availability. There may be 99.99% availability or 99.95 or 99.90. That varies depending on the class that you're using it. One of the classes that you could opt for is the one zone IA. This is where AWS will store your data in one availability zone only. Okay. The benefit of it is that the cost is lower. Okay. But it's designed and intended for those customers or the type of data where it's secondary backup. It's data that perhaps can be recreated. Because if you imagine there's a huge disaster in the data center in one availability zone, then you've lost your data. Okay, so the trade-off here is cost versus availability and data safety, right? Data availability. So you need to make a decision whether you are going to use a one zone IA. It's designed for recreatable data and it's designed for things like secondary backups. We've got archive classes. I mentioned earlier that many companies need to store their data for 7, 10 years, whatever. Then we've got specific archive classes as well for that. So you've got the Glacier Instant Archive class, which is, again, the cost much lower. Ideal for things like medical images, news media archives. The minimum number of days you need to keep your data in that to use Glacier Instant is 90 days. Okay, but this is intended for archival classes. We've got Glacier Flexible. So this is where your data is stored in an archive storage service. But when you come to access the data, you may have to wait a few minutes to a few hours, okay? Because the data needs to be extracted from archive and then presented to you so that you can then download it. And the benefit of this is a cost benefit. It's really low compared to instantly accessible data. And then finally, we've got something called Glacier Deep Archive. Now, this is, you're going to have to wait for at least 12 hours to be able to extract the data and then be able to download it. And this is best for compliance archives, really access data, and it's the lowest cost on the platform. So depending on your use case, depending on what it is that you are storing that data for, how long are you storing it for, and your access pattern, you're going to have to make a decision on the different storage classes that you store your data in. So here's a quick question. If you're building a resume website, right? If you're building a resume website and your data is sitting on that website, and you decide to use an S3 bucket to host that website, and we'll talk about how that works later on, which class would you choose? If you're hosting a resume website, and feel free to put things in the Q&A, which class would you opt for? Would you go for the standard class, standard IA, intelligent tiering? Which class would you actually put your data in? So when you're creating a resume website, you're going to send that link to everyone, all of the recruiters, all of the hiring managers, and you need to make sure that they can access that data instantly. Okay. So I'm getting a few responses. Okay. Glacier Instant, standard IA, intelligent. Okay. That's okay. Good. So if that data needs to be accessed instantly and frequently, because now you're sending that data to all of the recruiters out there, then you want to store it in standard, because any of the other classes, if you start accessing the data frequently, there is a penalty, okay, in terms of additional costs. Like for instance, with standard retrieval, there's a retrieval cost, there's a retrieval fee as well, okay, in addition to the cost of the actual storage. Same way with one zone IA, okay, and well, one zone IA, you probably don't even want to store your data there in case there's a disaster, then no one can access your resume website, right? And then you definitely don't want to store in any of the archives because you want to make it instantly accessible, and it's not an archive thing, it's frequently being accessed. You've sent your CV or the link to your CV to various recruiters, and you want to make sure that it's easily, instantly accessible for them. So the standard storage class is probably what you're going to use in that particular instance. Okay, good. Let's move on. So a few additional features that I want to highlight about S3 and how S3 is particularly useful, in terms of some of those core features that it offers. And it offers lots of different features. for you to build complete end-to-end applications as well. So with S3, one of the features that it offers is versioning. Okay, you can protect your data from being accidentally deleted. Okay, so every time you upload a data with the same file name, by default, it will overwrite the file that was there before. So if I create a file, if I create my resume website and I call it index.html and I upload it to S3, if I make changes to it and upload it again with the same name, the previous file that was in the bucket gets deleted, okay, gets overwritten. And obviously, we want to try and avoid accidental overwrites, okay, because people might make mistakes. So you can enable something called versioning that will ensure that every object that you upload, every copy of that object, every version of the object that you can upload is got a version ID attached to it, a new version ID. So if I make a change to that index.html document and I upload it again, it'll get a new version ID. This means that I can have multiple versions of the same file, and I can go back and retrieve those or look at those older versions if I need to. Okay, so every put request, every time I upload a new object, it gets a new version ID. It doesn't delete and overwrite the previous version of the file that is there. If I go ahead and actually delete the file by just identifying the file name itself, it doesn't delete the file. It puts something called a delete marker on the object. Okay, a delete marker simply says that this particular object is going to be hidden from view. Okay, if you want to delete a specific version because you no longer need it, or it's incorrect, or there's mistakes in it, or whatever, then you need to define a version ID of the actual object that you're trying to delete, and then you will be able to delete the file. So if you're worried about, oh, but if I enable versioning and I need to delete something because it's wrong or incorrect or whatever, that is possible. But by default, it becomes much more difficult to accidentally delete any file or object because you've enabled versioning. So versioning is a really cool feature that ensures that you can store multiple copies, multiple versions of your object, of your files, and of your data. So it's a great safety net for accidental overrides and deletes. Another feature is replication. Now, I mentioned this already. So replication, there are two types of replication. There's cross-region replication, where you are replicating data between one region and another. And again, the use cases are things like, backup, disaster recovery, but also because you want data to be closer to your end users, especially if you're in a multinational organization with multiple branch offices. You can also have same region replication. So you can have two buckets in the same region, and you can replicate data between it because you want that backup capability, but at the same time, you're restricted by regulatory requirements to keep the data within the same geographical border or political border as it might be. Okay, so replication is another cool feature that S3 offers you. And then it also offers you to allow you to host static websites. Now, this is where S3 becomes really, really powerful. And in fact, it's what you're going to be using, or some of it you're going to be using as part of this this week. So static website basically serve websites directly from S3. Now, what you can do is you can upload static web content, HTML documents, CSS, JavaScript files, and it will serve them directly to end browsers of your end users. There's no servers involved, no EC2, no Linux server, no Windows server, okay? And therefore no maintenance. You literally just upload all of your website files and you make them accessible over the internet. And then as a result of that, you benefit from the ability to actually serve your content using that static website hosting service. Just give me a second. Okay. And so ultimately, one of the other benefits of using Amazon S3 static website hosting is this fact that you can actually host static content and static website services on the AWS platform. And it's called static website hosting because one thing that you cannot do, however, is host server-side scripting on a static website service on S3. So what that means is if you need to do any kind of processing of data, if you are doing any kind of extraction or any kind of sort of manipulation of data on a website, you would still need a backend service of some sort, a backend compute service to handle that part of it. And we'll talk more about this in tomorrow's session when we look at EC2 and other compute services on the AWS platform. But the really cool benefit of static website hosting is you don't have to manage servers. You don't have to have servers for simply hosting normal landing pages or static web content on the AWS platform. In addition to that, it is actually possible to have a complete application built on this, because you can separate out your front-end presentation layer, the way how the website looks, the landing page, the forms, etc., using JavaScripts, because those JavaScripts run in the browser of the end user. And then in the backend, you can use compute services that are just handling all of the backend processing for your application. And we'll talk more about this in tomorrow's session, and as well as in Thursday's session as well. But static website hosting is an absolute game changer, because it means that for very minimum cost, you can host a complete website on S3 and have that presented to the entire planet. It's highly scalable. You don't have to manage how many servers, how you're responding to traffic. If there's lots of traffic coming in, you don't have to worry about that. AWS will scale automatically for you. So it's absolutely brilliant in that aspect. Okay, and so if we take a look at how static website hosting works, then basically with static website hosting, you've got different levels, you've got different use cases for it. So normally the way how it works, the way how you access data on S3 works is depending on how you actually access your data. The first one is API access. So basically, you've got Stacy, a developer, who needs to access our website, our S3 bucket and the data held in S3 bucket. So she can use the command line interface, or she can use the web console. Okay. When she makes a call to the S3 bucket using her computer and the command prompt or the command line terminal, if you're using a Mac or a Linux machine, or she uses a AWS management console, what she's actually doing is making what is called an API call. Okay, she's making an API request. We spoke about API calls yesterday, and she's accessing the data that way. And then she performs something like a get object API call, and the data gets downloaded to her computer. Right? So it will allow you to support both public and private content. And ultimately, this is the standard way of accessing data. When you convert an S3 bucket into a static website hosting service, you create what is known as a website endpoint. And with this website endpoint, someone on the internet can access your data using standard web browser requests, using HTTP requests. Okay, and the request is going to be delivered as an HTML document. So you have this benefit of allowing multiple users on the internet to be then able to access your data that is hosted on an S3 bucket. Something that was just initially designed and developed as a storage service is now a fully fledged website and website hosting service. Okay, there are different formats in the way how the actual URL is presented. This is usually based on the region in which you've created your bucket in. Not so important to be worried about that in any way, but just something to be aware of. Now, when it comes to use cases, where exactly can we use this? Well, you can use it for various things. You can use it for things like product launch websites, landing pages, one-page websites. If you are promoting a new product or a new service. Okay, so it's great for that. It's a great use case for that. You can also use it for things like offloading. Okay, so you can have a situation where you're using servers to host a web application, because the web application is going to process consumer or user data in some fashion. But all of the images, all of the videos, all of the documents like PDF documents, etc., can all be offloaded and stored in an S3 bucket instead of the ABS volumes, the hard drives attached to those servers, or the EFS file system that is mounted on those servers. And the benefit of that is you reduce your storage cost drastically, because Amazon S3 is going to be the cheapest storage solution for you when compared to EBS or EFS services. So offloading is another typical use cases that you might use S3 to host your data. So to create a bucket that will host a static website is really, really simple. You saw earlier that I created a bucket. You simply need to upload all of your website files, so your HTML files, your CSS, your JavaScript files, etc. And then you need to configure the bucket with a static website hosting service. And for that, you create the bucket with the name that you would like your website host name to be. You upload all of your static files. So this could be HTML, CSS, JavaScript, etc., anything that can run in the browser of the end user. And then you will need at least one index.html file, though you can rename this, and you will need one error.html file. This is if the index file, the primary main website page is down, then it can default to the error page instead. Like maybe you want to leave a maintenance message if you're busy working on the website, for example. You want to make sure that you grant all files public access. So I mentioned about the fact that we can create bucket policies earlier that can grant anonymous access. And so that way, everyone on the planet can then access your bucket and obviously the files within that bucket. And you want to enable this feature that's called static website hosting. So this allows you to ensure that you can then distribute your content over the internet. You can optionally add a DNS CNAME to point to the Amazon URL. So when you create a static website, it will give you a URL. Now, the URL doesn't look very pretty. It's a long, convoluted, difficult to remember URL, okay? Because it's part of the S3 globally unique URL naming convention. But what you can do is you can use a DNS provider wherever you're hosting your domain name to actually configure a CNAME, canonical name that will point your domain name to that bucket, to that website URL. So mycompany.com will be pointed to that S3 website URL, so that anyone on the internet that types in mycompany.com is automatically redirected to that website URL, which is the S3 bucket static website hosting URL. Okay, so you can use your own custom domain name as well. Okay, before we go any further, let me just quickly check if there are any more questions. Okay. Okay, just quickly going to spend half a minute on a question. So I've got a question from an anonymous attendee. So I don't know who you are, sir, or madam. You wish to enter into cybersecurity. Perhaps if you can just reach out to me on LinkedIn, we can connect there, and I can guide you accordingly. Okay. Okay. Are there any additional charges for hosting website on S3? So that's a good question, Salim. So basically, if you are going to host your website on S3, you got to remember that you're going to pay for the storage cost. So if your website is huge, it's occupying gigabytes and gigabytes of storage, then yes, there's a cost per gigabyte, but there's also a cost per transfer out. So if it's a small website, it's going to be negligible, okay, unless you have millions and millions of hits on your website, okay, then you're going to start seeing cost increasing slightly. But otherwise, we're talking about pennies and cents here, okay, it's not going to be very expensive at all. But there are charges for hosting the actual storage cost and the cost of transferring data out, and there's request cost as well. But they're fairly negligible for standard websites. Unless that website is extremely popular and gone all viral, then you might see an increase in cost there a little bit. Okay, great. Let's move on to the next topic. So we understand now, hopefully, that S3 is an object storage solution. It's used to obviously store data. They're stored as objects in a flat file structure. You can use various features of S3 for backups, for managing data, for storing customer data, storing any kind of data that you need. And that data can be of any type: images, videos, documents, whatever you like. We looked at some of the features like versioning, cross-region replication. There's even things like lifecycle management. And we also looked at the different storage classes. So depending on your actual use case, you must make a decision on the type of storage class you will store your data in. The next thing that we started looking at was obviously static website hosting, which is an amazing feature of the S3 service. It actually forms the bulk of many websites out there, the actual entry point, the front end of most websites that you're looking at today. And you'll find that S3 is heavily used for static website hosting services. Static website hosting on S3 itself, however, is not entirely the best way of doing things, because there's another service that you need to add to it, especially if you want to go into production, and that is CloudFront. And we'll talk about that next. So yesterday, I briefly introduced you to CloudFront, specifically focusing around edge locations. So edge locations are these additional data center facilities that you do not have direct access to. The only way to access them is through the CloudFront service. So CloudFront makes use of edge location to distribute your content, videos, images, documents across globally to all the users on the planet so that it's more available and easily accessible to them on low latency networks. Okay, and we spoke briefly about how edge locations work specifically. So for instance, we had a look at the fact that the data is actually distributed to the various edge locations so that users on the other side of the planet will have cached copies that they can access from their local edge location. So we'll move on and talk more about exactly what CloudFront is and how it works. So as an example here, I've got users across the planet that are accessing files from an S3 bucket. Now, users in Australia are going to find very low latency connectivity. There's a video file over here that all the users are trying to access because it's gone highly viral. Some customers on the other side of the planet are going to experience high latency issues. It might take a little bit of time, a few seconds extra to actually download. There may be some buffering, etc. And you don't want that experience for your end users. Okay, so regardless of however many times they access that particular file, it will still need to be fetched from that bucket that's sitting in Sydney. So instead, what we can do, okay, and this sort of happens consistently time and time again, and it's repeated. So instead, what we can do is we can have edge locations, and we can configure CloudFront. Now, CloudFront will automatically configure the edge locations and the caching services for you. You just need to create what is known as a distribution point. And automatically, CloudFront will create that distribution point for you. And then you need to tell CloudFront where is the origin, where is the actual server or the S3 bucket or the application load balancer that is serving that content. So we will tell CloudFront that it is this bucket in Sydney that has the content that we're trying to distribute to our users. There are various settings and configuration items to set up in CloudFront. And then what happens is CloudFront will provide you with a special URL. That special URL will mean that users will access your data, in this case, this video, via the edge location distribution points. And so the data will be sent across and cached locally to those edge locations. The first time the data is ever accessed from a particular region, from a particular location, it will be fetched from the origin, but subsequent access will be fetched from the edge location. So the distance travel is going to be drastically reduced and the latency is going to improve substantially. And that's how CloudFront actually works. Okay, so CloudFront is brilliant, and you will need to add it as part of your website application if you want to make it production grade, because there are certain caveats, certain things to be aware of if you're just going to expose your website on an S3 bucket on the internet. Okay, for one thing, S3 doesn't give you by default an HTTPS URL. It's just a standard HTTP, and you want to be using HTTPS so that you've got encryption in transit. So CloudFront will add that layer for you, that security layer for you. And so if we take a look at that resume website, if we've got a customer in Sydney that wants to create her resume website using your application, what she can do is basically she can either, when she actually sets this up, she can make use of that CloudFront distribution point. So if you create your website application, and you create a bucket that's going to store her resume as a website, you will put a CloudFront distribution in front of it. Okay, and what will happen then is that the user will be accessing the website via that distribution point. Sorry, further. And then she'll be able to access that data more securely as well. Okay, and so this really is something that you want to consider when you're building your end-to-end solution. If you're going to use S3 to host static websites, remember that if you've got users across the planet accessing that website, then some users are going to experience slightly higher latency compared to other users, And using a CloudFront distribution point is going to add several layers of benefits, several benefits to you. One being that it gives you the HTTPS capability so that data is transferred encrypted. Another being the fact that it offers additional security features in terms of protecting your actual bucket. There's a service called Web Application Firewalling that can be integrated, which is also used with CloudFront, which I talk about in my course as well, that adds as an additional firewall. But the functionality benefit of using CloudFront in front of your S3 bucket is that now anyone on the planet is going to have really fast, really low latency access to your data because the data is going to be cached locally at edge locations closer to the end consumer. Okay, so what we'll do next is we'll go ahead and create a CloudFront distribution point for our server. And I'll show you exactly how that works in a minute. So let me just stop sharing. And I'm going to bring up the AWS Management Console. Just give me a minute. Okay, so let's share the screen first. Okay, actually, let's share the whole screen first. Okay, hopefully you can see my screen. If I could just get a confirmation whether you can see the AWS Management Console. Yeah, okay, thank you. Okay, so we are on my resume website, my S3 bucket. Now remember, this hasn't been configured with static website hosting just yet or anything like that. What we want to do instead is use CloudFront as a service in front of it and use CloudFront as the distribution point for my actual website, okay, for my actual my actual resume website. And before we go any further, I want to quickly show you what this website looks like at the moment. Okay, so this is the website here. So this is Jason Coffey's resume. Okay, and as you can see, it's a very plain looking site. It's not exciting at all. Okay, but we will get it a little bit more fancy on Friday. Okay, so at the moment, this is Jason Coffey. This is just a basic plain page. It's an HTML page, index.html. Okay, and it gives you the name, summary, technicals, job, previous experience, certifications, education, etc. And fantastic. So that's all it is. It's just a normal HTML document. Okay. So what we're going to do first is we're going to actually upload this to our website. And I've created the website folder. So I'm going to go ahead and upload that. And I'm going to just copy it there. Okay. So when you come to actually upload, so here I'm going to go into the website folder and I'm going to click upload. That's going to bring up this screen where I can just drag and drop my actual web page. So I'm going to drag and drop from my Finder into here. Okay, and click upload. Okay, so I've uploaded this index.html page, right, in resume website bucket in a folder called website. Okay, so that's all I've done now. Next, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and actually create a CloudFront distribution point for it. Okay, so we're going to go into CloudFront. I'm just going to search for CloudFront. Okay. And I'm going to go ahead and in CloudFront, on the left side, you can create distributions, you can have policies. There are various other reporting and statistics and telemetry information that you can define. But we're creating a distribution point that will use that S3 bucket as the origin of my website. Okay, so I'm going to click create a distribution. And there are different categories of distribution. I'm just going to go with the pay as you go right now, just to keep things a bit simple. Click next. And I need to give it a name. So I'm going to call this one, yeah, sounds good. I'm just going to call this one CloudFront. Okay, so that I know what it is. Rajesh Resume CloudFront. The distribution type is a single website. Okay. And here, if I had my own domain name to point to it, if I had a custom domain name like, rajesh.com or something like that, then obviously I can use that as well. I don't at the moment, so we're just going to ignore that. I'm going to click next. Here is where we'll define where is the origin of the actual data, of the actual website that we are presenting. So you can have different origin types. You can have S3, you can have elastic load balancers, API gateways, VPC origins. There are different types of origins that you can have of the actual data. So we're going to leave it at S3. And I'm going to point it to the actual S3 bucket that has my data, right? So I'm going to go ahead and click Browse S3. And I created the Rajesh resume site. So I'm going to choose that. Okay. And so this is the actual S3 bucket where my data is, where my HTML document is for JSON Coffee. Okay. So here I'm going to go ahead and go down a little bit. Now, there are some settings here that I'm not going to go into today. We're going to leave them at the default values. Basically, what these settings are is that at this point in time, if I go to the actual bucket, okay, if I take you to the bucket and I take you to permissions, currently we have block public access enabled. Okay, I've not disabled it. And there is no bucket policy to allow inbound access. Now, if you were creating a static website on S3, without using CloudFront, you would have to do two things. One is you would have to disable block public access. And two, you'd have to create a bucket policy to allow anybody on the planet to access the bucket. And that's a viable option, but perhaps not the best, most secure option. This is why we're using S3. This is why we're using CloudFront, because with CloudFront, we're adding a layer of security in front of it. Only CloudFront can access the bucket, and you are accessing your data via CloudFront. So CloudFront basically proxies your requests to access the data in S3. CloudFront is good, and we want to use CloudFront for this because CloudFront will give you that encryption in transit using the SSL and the HTTPS requests. CloudFront also offers inbuilt protection like firewalls, web application firewalls, etc., that you might want to use for your service. So if I go back to the distribution, and we're going to use the recommended settings. And again, if you deep dive further into this and take the solution architect course, obviously all of this is explained in more detail. But for now, we're just going to leave it at the default settings. And we want to allow private S3 bucket access to CloudFront only. So only CloudFront can access the data. You can access the data. You can access the website via CloudFront. Okay, so CloudFront is the proxy in between. So we'll go ahead and click next. And here again, this is where if you're doing this for the real world situation, if you're doing this for your own production grade where you want to provide it to, those recruiters and hiring managers, then you want to enable the web application firewall. Depending on the plan that you're on, there is some cost associated with it. But if you go for the free plan, you get X number of requests that you can make free of charge. Okay, I'm going to disable it for now, just because I want to keep things a bit simple. I'm going to click next. And I'm going to go ahead and click the distribution. So right now, what's happening is my CloudFront distribution is getting created. It's sitting in front of my S3 bucket, or it's basically proxying all the requests to the S3 bucket. And it's going to update the S3 bucket's bucket policy so that only CloudFront can send traffic to it. And I'll show you that in a second. It takes a couple of minutes to complete the deployment. So just bear with me here. If you have any questions in the meantime, feel free to drop that into the chat or into the Q&A whilst we wait for this to set up live. Any questions at all, feel free to just let me know. Okay, I'm just waiting for this to complete. So in fact, we can probably go to distribution, and it's currently in deploying stage. Let's refresh that again, just see how it's getting deployed. Yeah, okay. So maybe give it another minute or so, and that should get deployed correctly. Okay, quick question from Manish about watching the videos again. So that's available on the YouTube channel. Let me just, I'll share the link very quickly. Just bear with me. Just bear with me 1 second. So I'll put that. Just share that. Okay. Okay, let's just check if there are any other questions. Okay, so that's being deployed. Can CloudFront work with Google Drive storage? CloudFront is really going to be supporting all of the backend services on AWS, so that's something to be aware of. Yeah, CloudFront will really only work with the AWS platform. You can have multi-cloud scenarios where you're connecting using network connectivity, using VPCs and network services across the different cloud providers to interconnect them. But that's something I'll look into actually, whether you can use CloudFront directly with Google Drive, and come back to you, Nagesh. Okay, so here we have got obviously now that deployed. Okay, so let's just take a look at how this works very quickly. Bear with me 1 second. So if we go into the CloudFront distribution point, okay, so that's now deployed, and that's the ARN, and we've also got the domain name just there. So here, what you're looking at is the CloudFront distribution point has been deployed. It's telling you all of the details. It's telling you what the origin is. So the origin is this particular S3 website, okay, and also the fact that it's also got the S3 as the origin, and it connects to it directly now. So if we take a look at things like behaviors and stuff, it tells you that the default path that will be followed will be to connect you to that particular S3 bucket. And it tells you that, in fact, it's also going to be using HTTPS. Now, these are all different settings that you can configure when you customly build your CloudFront distribution. What we did was we followed the default settings, okay, where we didn't define specifically what the cache policy was or the protocol policy was. It all set that up for you. That's just the default settings, but all of these are customizable in the way how you connect to it. So these are some important concepts just to be aware of in terms of the way how the CloudFront distribution works. Okay, just give me 1 second. Okay. The next thing that we need to see is if we go back to the actual bucket, right? And if we go to the resume bucket, if we go down to permissions, we need to just make sure that this sets up correctly. Okay, bear with me. Okay, I'm just waiting for it to set up. Okay, so here what we are looking at in terms of the way how the CloudFront distribution point has been set up is that it is now, if we take a look at the origin, like I said, it's pointing to that S3 bucket. So we'll come back to this and take a look at exactly how the setting is complete. But currently what we have is the S3 bucket is now being served by the CloudFront distribution point. And I'll come back to that in a short while once we all got settings in place and it's all set up and ready to go. Okay, so we currently, if I bring back up the slide, just bear with me. So next, what I want to do is quickly show you a particular use case of where this actually works as well. Okay, so I'm going to share the screen again. And just let me know if you can see my screen again. Okay, yep, thank you. Okay, so we've just created a CloudFront distribution that's pointing to that S3 bucket. And as we progress through, I'll also show you then how we connect to it a little bit later. For now, I want you to also consider a real-world architecture in the way how this is actually configured, okay? So, or how you would use this specifically. I mentioned earlier that with a static S3 bucket, you've just got a bucket that's exposed out onto the internet. And yes, you can use policies to allow people to only do specific things like access the data. But with CloudFront, you have this ability to add additional layers of security, like the WAF, web application firewall, like the HTTPS requests, etc. If you take a look at a real world scenario, so here's a real world use case where we are basically using S3 as the actual front end of an application. Okay, so here in this example, we've got a front end website that's serving content. It might be a landing page. It might be a page with some forms or some information or some data. It might be a page where you can upload files to. So that lovable site that we looked at earlier, for instance, could potentially be hosted on an S3 bucket. Not saying that it is, I don't know if it is, but it could be, okay? So you can have complete functioning web application or website from the front user interface presented to you and is provided to you via an S3 bucket. In front of that S3 bucket, we can put our CloudFront distribution so that users across the planet can access that bucket through the CloudFront distribution point. And so we have a situation where the user now is able to access the data or the website in the S3 bucket via the CloudFront distribution point. The user might upload a file, just the way how we uploaded, or I uploaded the resume file on lovable.dev. And then in the backend, it's going to use that file and do something with it. Okay, so maybe it's going to extract all of the data. Maybe what it did was when I uploaded the resume PDF document, it extracted all of that data of Jason and his profile and his experiences, and then it converted it into a website, right? And it turned it into a website. And to do that portion of it, converting that raw text into an HTML document, it made use of some compute processes. Now, specifically, we can use something like functions, like Lambda functions, and I'll talk more about Lambda functions tomorrow. It's a compute service that allows you to run code to interact, process, manage, and handle data processing in any form that you want to do. So it's basically a compute service that can be executed to run a piece of code in response to a particular action. So here what happened is, or here what could happen is the user will upload the file to the S3 bucket. The S3 bucket will trigger the backend services to initialize and to be invoked and then perform some sort of action. Maybe turn that raw PDF document into an HTML presentable website, which is something that we'll try out on Friday, as I mentioned. And obviously, at the same time, you've got some databases that you might use to store profile information or any kind of data, or what the user is doing or what transactions the user has made, that kind of thing, and a backend database. And here we're using a database called DynamoDB, for example. What you will also notice is that there is always a role or more than one role involved in it. So I spoke about IAM roles yesterday that allows one resource to access another resource, right? If you look at the way how it works, in order for any of these resources to talk to each other, they need permissions to do so. If that bucket is going to upload a file and invoke a function to do something, to react to that, it needs the ability to have that permission to do so. If this Lambda function is going to take information from the user and update a database, it needs permission to do so. How we give it permissions is via IAM roles. Okay, and we spoke about IAM roles yesterday to grant permissions to allow one resource to access another resource, etc. There's another product over here called Amazon CloudWatch. Now, Amazon CloudWatch we'll briefly look at on Friday as well. Basically, it allows you to monitor the health and the performance of your various resources by measuring various metrics, CPU utilization, amount of memory use, amount of disk space use, that kind of thing. Okay. It also allows you to capture log information. So when these Lambda functions, these are pieces of code that are running, are doing various tasks, it can actually export exactly what it's doing to CloudWatch as a set of logs. And the benefit of that is that you can then track exactly what's going on, and it's great for troubleshooting. Okay, so that's a typical real world use case where I'm using an S3 bucket to host my front end, a back end that's running some code on Lambda, which incidentally is serverless compute. So there are no servers here involved. An API gateway that basically allows you to send requests securely to backend services, a database, which incidentally is also serverless from your perspective, to store, data more persistently. So for instance, user profile, user transaction, order history, that kind of thing, and a role or a set of roles to allow communication, authentication, and authorization across those services. So hopefully you're beginning to see that we're using various services on the AWS ecosystem to build an end-to-end solution. Okay, and then obviously we've got monitoring and observability with something like CloudWatch. Okay, so what I'm going to do next is just present you with give me a second, with today's homework. Okay. Okay, so what we've done so far today is we've just created an S3 bucket and we've uploaded a file to it, and we've created a CloudFront distribution point. Tomorrow, we're going to look at it even further, and then we're going to move on and take a look at how we can do similar sort of setup using EC2 and compute services like a Linux server. So there are several options that you have to actually host your website. Today, we've talked about how we can host it on an Amazon S3 bucket, but you can also host it on an EC2 instance like a normal web server. And so that is an option. So that's something to consider as well. Deciding which set of services to use to actually host your resource. Now that is going to be based on the actual use case, the trade-offs, the decisions as to why you would choose one over the other, which is more of an architectural discussion that obviously you would need to do when you are actually building solutions in the cloud. Okay, so next what I want to do is quickly introduce you to today's homework. You want to basically create your S3 bucket. You want to upload a sample resume document to the bucket, and you want to create that CloudFront distribution for it as well, just by following the video exercises. And incidentally, if you want a copy of the actual resume doc, so give me a second over here, I'll stop sharing and reshare again. Just give me a minute. Okay, I'll reshare the screen. Bear with me. Okay, so you should be able to see my screen. Okay, let me know if you can see my screen again. Yeah, okay. Okay, so this is a GitHub repository where I'm putting in the daily slides as well that you can have access to. And you can then basically gain access to the actual source code file. So here we've got, for today's lab, I've got the index.html document that you can just download to your computer and then upload it to your S3 bucket if you want to use the same one. And I suggest you do that just so that we can all be on the same page and keep the exercise going smoothly. So that's one thing to do. So feel free to use this GitHub repository. So it's github.com IIS Academy /AWS Cloud AI Essentials. And then you will find that it's all in there. Okay, and I'll upload that on a daily basis. So yesterday's slide is there as well. So if you want a copy of the slide, and then today's slide is there as well, along with the actual index.html file for you. I'll put this as a link on the recording. So the recording is available on the YouTube channel. So there it is there. That will be available now. It's streaming as we speak. And so in a few minutes after the session, it will be in the description box. So you can directly link up and see the link for the GitHub repo as well. So you can download that as well. Okay. Yeah. 1 second, I will give you the link here. Okay. And you also have access to the YouTube channel, which is just there. Okay. So so what I'll do is like I said, I'll put that for you in a link, and I'll send that across to you as well, so you can have access to that. And in the description box, you'll find the link of the GitHub repo as well. Okay, so that's what we want to do for today. If you focus on, or if I get you to focus on, obviously, sorry, give me 1 second. If I get you to focus on tonight, if you do as your homework, or this evening, if you create your S3 bucket, download that sample resume document from the GitHub repo, upload it to S3 in the website folder, and then create your CloudFront distribution. And then tomorrow we'll see how that works. And then we'll take it from there. And tomorrow we'll also move on to EC2. We'll also talk about Lambda as well in a bit more detail to see how that works as well. So tomorrow will be compute services on the AWS platform. As usual, if there's the link to the actual YouTube channel. So that's where you can get access to the live recording. If you want to connect with me, there is my LinkedIn, and obviously the IIS Academy website is there as well. Let me just go back to Zoom. If you've got any questions, let me know. So cool, thank you, Sanya. Any other questions, feel free to just put it into the chat, into the Q&A. Just quickly take a look at okay. Okay, just looking at a question. I'm a dev now as an FSC. I wish to switch to cybersecurity, and I thought of moving to the cloud. I cleared AWS AI Practitioner Foundation, and I need your advice to move further. Sure. If you want to connect with me on LinkedIn, we can definitely catch up there, Mohammed. Okay, and it'll be easier that way to have a discussion. Okay, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. Sure. Okay. Awesome. Any other questions? Okay, well, if there are no any other questions, then we're going to call it the end of the day, and I'll see you folks tomorrow. Tomorrow, remember, we're going to be looking at compute services on AWS. That's going to comprise of EC2. We'll talk a little bit about containers as well at a high level, and we'll also talk about Lambda functions, which we just had a look at in that use case a few moments ago, and see what Lambda functions actually are. So I'll see you folks tomorrow. Have a great day. Thank you again for taking the time out for this week. Thanks, everyone.